Alright, let's do this. Let's replace the harmonic balancer and the subframe on my C5 Corvette. I have my list here of all the things that either need to disconnect or remove, and man, it's a big list, so let's get started.
The blend doesn't really feel like it's been nerfed, and I'm using an XT40. Find out soon. But I mean, there's less.
So I was originally going to try and film every little step of the process that I'm doing right now and every piece that I'm taking off from the car, but it's just a little too difficult and cumbersome to film every little angle while I'm doing it, and I'm just trying to get things done so I can get to the main job, which is using the crane here to support the engine, drop the subframe, replace the balancer, etc. So I'm just going to do a quick summary to show you guys everything that I've removed so far and kind of how I'm doing my list. So the first one and the big one is I took the brake calipers and the rotors off of the car, so I just have the calipers now hanging with some bungees. That way I don't have to disconnect any brake lines and then worry about bleeding the brakes later. And it was a good thing I did that because the rotors were kind of like rust welded to the hubs here and the spindles, so I was able to get those off, and you know, I'm going to clean that up with a wire brush when we get to that point of the kind of reassembly process. So I got that done on both sides. You can see there. The other thing too, so I got the alternator off, got the belt off, a bunch of other like minor nuances, and you know, got the shocks unmounted from the top here, which is why the suspension is drooping a lot. Got the tie rods undone here, got the little ride control module disconnected, so this piece here connects to the suspension arm, so I got to disconnect that. Let's see what else. I disconnected all of the power steering lines on this side, so down, it's gonna be kind of hard to see here, but down in here, this is actually the part of the process when I found out about the crack in the subframe. So I disconnect the power steering lines that feed it's basically the to and return from the power steering rack for the power steering lines here. So I had to disconnect those from the inputs there, and then I zip tied some Ziploc bags up in here to kind of keep all the fluid from dripping down, because we were getting a lot of fluid dripping down. So I did that. The other thing I did was I started kind of tick marking all of the points on the suspension that'll be taken off. So obviously everything that mounts to the subframe is going to be removed. So I've been using like little Sharpie marks. It's kind of like to verify my torque spec. So, and I had labeled these, numbered them. I know there's washers behind here too, so I got to make sure I keep track of that. But yeah, so it's just a lot of minor nuances, like unbolting things from the subframe. Oh, you had to unbolt the ABS module from up here, so then it's just sitting in a bracket that's attached to the subframe, so the subframe will just slide out right from underneath it. And then the next thing that I really go through and do is there's all these little like plastic clips, like you can kind of see right there. So there's these plastic clips that mount to these holes in the subframe, and they're various electrical connectors for like the wheel speed sensors, the ABS module, stuff for the ride control, the adaptive ride control, so things like that. So I'm trying to just disconnect all of that. Oh, and some hard brake lines also mount with some plastic little clips to the subframe. So all those little connectors need to be removed from the subframe, so I can obviously just drop it out. Because the plan is to basically undo the upper control arm on both sides, undo the motor mounts from the bottom, and then obviously the 4 subframe bolts, and then just drop this whole thing down with my hydraulic jack. Obviously, well, the engine is supported from the top. The other thing I got too was this load leveler from Harbor Freight, just to make sure that when I use the engine crane to support the engine from the top, it's nice and even and it doesn't want to suddenly go crooked on me. So I just got that just to mount to the engine crane here. And for the mounting points on the engine that I'll be using, there's this open hole in the head here. It's a threaded hole on the passenger side. So I got some, it's an M10 bolt, so I got some whatever the highest grade of metric bolts is. It's not grade 8. I guess metric uses their own standardization for the tensile strength of bolts, so it's the highest grade that you can get for metric hardware. And then the other mounting point I'll be using is just one of the bolts for the alternator here. So I'll feed this bolt through. It'll be a good double shear support point, and then the chain for the low leveler will come right here. So that's kind of the plan right now. I'm just kind of slowly ticking away all of the little pieces on my to-do list here to take it off. Kind of what I've been doing is I have my main list here, and then as I think of stuff and or realize something, I add it to this list. Basically, a red check mark means it's been removed, so that way I know I completed it in the disassembly part of it, and then when I go back to reassemble the car, I'll be using a green check mark to indicate that that part was reinstalled or retightened, fastened down, so that I don't miss anything when I'm putting the car back together. I'm trying to break this up, so I'm not trying to like kill myself and doing this all in one day. I don't want to like get tired, and then when I get tired and just fatigued, I get frustrated. So obviously you want to pace yourself and take your time so you don't make any mistakes, or you can lessen the chance of making any mistakes. Plus, when I actually do the act of lowering the whole subframe and basically the front suspension, I would like to have an extra set of hands here just to help me in case I get stuck with something. So I'll probably either having my family or a friend help me. So I'm kind of arranging that right now. But I'm going to keep chugging along, and you guys will see the progress as it comes. Alright guys, so it is the next day. I basically spent the end of yesterday just cleaning up a lot of the suspension components since I took everything off that I was able to do with just one person. So today I have my friend Zach over here today, and he's going to be helping me replace the subframe and the balancer as well. So the first step that we got to do is take the hood off so that the engine crane actually has room to get over top of the engine to hold it up. Are we still connected to something? Yeah, we got the is there a wire? It's okay, your head's not heavy at all. Okay. It's no longer a Ronald McDonald colored car. It's so weird that they do that, these washers. So just put these together. That's it. So there's two washers, the number 2, just haven't fallen off yet. Alright, now one with 3? Okay, now what's happening with 4? Alright, I'm doing 4 first. Neither yet. Yeah, well, the one is stuck to the frame, and this one's stuck on the floor. Okay, so we got the upper control arms disconnected. We were kind of just running through my list here and verifying that everything that needs to be disconnected, indicated by a red check mark, is disconnected. And then we got the jack underneath the subframe with a piece of wood, and then those cinder blocks with the wood on top of it are just a safety measure for whatever reason. If the engine hoist fails, then those are under the oil pan for the engine, which is a structural part that you can jack up from actually. So that's our safety measure. So basically now we're going to start with undoing the 2 motor mount bolts and then the 4 subframe bolts. Alright, motor mount numero 1. Here, I'll just take it. Or you want to do that one?
I was going to say, yeah, just hand me that side.
Alright, here we go. How are we looking?
Looking good.
Okay, let me check.
Oh, you know what? I think I see another clip.
Engines looks like it's not moving, right?
Engine.
Ooh, engine went down.
Engine went down.
Okay, so let's...
Back engine up?
Yeah. Okay, let me put more load on this then. Okay, so we basically had to cut real quick because we underestimated how heavy everything is that we're lifting, and it's probably because the engine's still connected to the torque tube and transmission. We had it set on the 1/2 ton setting, and the back of the engine hoist started to come up. So we quickly then raised this back up. We took the tension off of the load leveler. We moved the arm down to the 1 ton setting, which should be plenty of lifting clearance, at least that's what we're hoping, or lifting capacity. So now we've got tension on the load leveler again, so now we're going to slowly lower this jack and hopefully get this subframe out. Okay, take 3. Alright, so you let me know. Keep an eye on the back of the...
Yep, we're lifting.
We are?
We will. I think just a little bit.
I think the...
Go for it a little bit. Oh, stop. Right.
No.
Nope.
This is going to have to be basically directly under the car.
Yeah.
Okay, major update. We got the subframe out of the car. There were a lot of lines that we had to watch out for. In particular, this brake line here. This had to go with the subframe because it wraps underneath the steering rack. But this whole thing's out of the car. I also found an old adapter that I lost, well, probably about 2 years ago. So that was cool. So now we're prepping to do the balancer and also put the motor mounts on, which are somewhere in the garage here. Oh, right there. So once we do all that, we kind of clean up the area underneath, get the new balancer on, then we'll get the steering rack dressed up on the new subframe and start putting everything back up.
Did we slip?
Yeah.
Back it up. That top didn't slip. Alright, seems like we're snug.
Can't tell if this is coming.
You're coming off.
It is?
Yeah.
Okay,
Don't squish me with the car. Oh, yes.
I got it. Where you know? Oh, safety guns. Good idea.
Dirt in my ass.
What do you mean, safety squints? Come on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is she coming?
Yeah, I think so. Go. It's just, look at the cable right by me. Every time you move, a ton of dirt is coming out of here. Oh, we're almost there. There we go.
Oh, baby. Okay.
Got it?
Yeah, there's so much dirt in here. Okay, well, it's a good thing I got a new front main seal because that thing was definitely leaking, flinging oil and dirt, grime everywhere. So I'm going to clean that off. I got my seal puller tool, pop in a new seal, and then we're going to start prepping to get the new balancer on. So looking at the whole subframe, front suspension, we're degreasing the steering rack over here to prep it, because basically I'm going to be installing the steering rack and the brake line on the new subframe, and that's the only thing we'll be loading up into the car. All the suspension stuff I'm going to be installing after the fact so that we don't have to have all the engine crane and blocks supporting it. But look at this right here. That's the crack. So you can see how gnarly of a crack that is. So I'm glad I caught that, and we're replacing this. This is the farthest I've ever gone into a car, but I'm glad I'm doing it. It's pushing me. I'm learning a lot. It's definitely stressful at points, but I'm definitely enjoying the process, and when we get this thing back on the road, it'll be that much more worth it. $235 foot-pounds. We need the rock here, basically. Nope. Alright, let's go get a pipe. Alright. ABS pipe for torque. Amazing what a little leverage can do. Okay, good morning everybody. It is the next day. A lot has happened since that last clip, and unfortunately most of it was done off camera just because I was so focused on trying to get it done. Sometimes I just get in the groove and totally forget to set up the camera, and then it just kind of domino effects from there. But I want to take this time to update you guys and give a summary on everything that I've done up to this point to wrap up this video, because I'm going to split basically everything that has yet to be done into the next video. Okay, so starting from the top, just because that's easiest for me on how to recollect everything, it all started basically with disconnecting all of the pieces that are needed in order to drop this whole front subframe, and that involves, you know, you're talking power steering lines, you're talking electrical connectors, anything related to the brakes here. This car has the F45 suspension, so all the little electrical pieces for these shocks, which these will eventually be going away because I'll be getting coilovers, but basically disconnecting all of that, obviously disconnecting the battery, taking the alternator off, taking the belt off, all that good stuff to prep for lowering the subframe. And then the other thing too is we did have to disconnect one brake line because the ABS module, which is right down here, which is currently being partially hung up with zip ties, that brake line that feeds the passenger front tire or wheel goes underneath the steering rack on the subframe. So it would literally be impossible to drop the subframe with that brake line still in place. So I did have to disconnect the brake line on this side. From there, we're talking suspension related items. So for me, because I'm dropping the whole subframe, I just left the lower control arms attached here, disconnected the upper control arms from their mounting points up in the car up here, and then also disconnected the shock and then this little ride control sensor arm piece here. So once you get all that disconnected and everything, the upper control arms will kind of fold out and droop, and you can leave the leaf spring in with the subframe as well. And from that point, you're ready to start lowering the subframe once you undo the motor mount bolts as well. Basically right, let's see if I can get my finger in there, right there, that hole, and then on the other side there's a nut. That's the bottom side of the motor mount. So you got to undo those guys to obviously disconnect the subframe from the motor, because the motor is staying with the car. From there, what I did was, and the cinder blocks are at the back of the car right now, but I did have cinder blocks basically underneath, right where those jack stands are that's holding the exhaust support, or the exhaust system right now, with some plywood and 2x6s just resting right underneath the oil pan as a safety measure in case for whatever reason my engine hoist failed on me. Before you start undoing the subframe bolts, there's 4 total, 2 in the front, 2 in the back. You're going to want to lift up the engine slightly. So as I mentioned earlier, we used the alternator bracket here and then a open threaded hole on the head there on the passenger side. I got a load leveler here, and you're not actually raising the engine up, you're just basically trying to keep it supported in its current position. You can't pull it up too high because there's a bunch of connection pieces back underneath here that you'll actually start crunching if you pull it up too high, and it starts kind of running into the cowl slash firewall. So we had the engine support and everything, and then from there we started to slowly, one corner at a time. So we have the front subframe bolt here, rear subframe bolt back here. Zach and I slowly undid all of these 4 bolts, basically in kind of like an alternating pattern, so it kind of evenly lowers this down. While we did that, we also had my floor jack here with a 2x6 kind of going front to back on the subframe to basically just kind of slowly relieve the pressure off of those nuts and then be ready to start supporting the weight of the subframe and all of the suspension pieces attached to it. The subframe by itself is pretty light. I'd say it probably weighs maybe 25-30 pounds, but when you add the leaf spring, the spindles, the upper control arm, lower control arm, it starts to get pretty heavy, and it also can wobble a little bit. So just be very careful with balancing it as you lower it down. Obviously the engine crane is just positioned here so I can shut the garage, but we had the engine crane flipped around so that it was coming straight into the engine bay, and we just have enough clearance in between the quick jack and the legs of the engine hoist to basically roll the subframe out from this way. And we had it kind of still raised up a decent amount so it cleared these legs, and we were just kind of balancing it as I rolled it out this way. Basically, as we lowered the subframe down, we were checking to make sure it didn't catch on any lines, whether that be hydraulic for power steering, brake lines, electrical, stuff like that. And the only thing that we were having issues with was that one brake line. I didn't realize at the time that that brake line actually has to go down with the subframe. It's the brake line that comes down from the ABS module, runs across actually kind of on the inner face of the subframe, and then comes up and attaches here. So we had to disconnect that, and the only other tricky thing was the ABS module wanted to keep coming down with the car. Basically there's 2 bolts on the ABS module bracket. I'll just show you the bracket over here. So this is the part of the bracket that holds the ABS module. So I undid these 2 kind of nuts that are connected to the studs on the module, and I thought that was enough to break it loose, but it turns out I also needed to undo these 2 bolts as well. I thought leaving these in and then just having this go down with the subframe and having the ABS module slide out was enough, but this really just, those 2 bolts need to be undone to free this up enough to break it loose from the ABS module, because every time we lowered the subframe down, it kept wanting to pull the ABS module down with it. So once we got the ABS module free, we just supported it with some zip ties just so it's not dangling by the brake lines themselves. And from there, the whole subframe and front suspension was able to be lowered out of the car. And as I showed you guys earlier, from that point, I was able to see the top side of the crack that was forcing me to replace the subframe right here. So you can see, starting right about in this corner here, the crack kind of grows and then stops right about here, or at least from what I can see. You know, cracks like to grow, especially with vibration. So this was the top side of the crack where the fluid was actually leaking down from. So that was just further reinforcement that this whole subframe needed to be replaced. And from that point, the whole front side underneath the car was pretty open, so allowed for a lot of good access to get in there and start working on things. The replacement subframe wasn't in there at that point. At that point, we just had the engine crane supporting the engine from the top side with the load leveler, and then those cinder blocks and wood combo underneath the oil pan as a fail-safe. So from there, my buddy Zach and I, we started the task of removing the stock harmonic balancer. So first things first, we actually had to break the OEM crank bolt loose and remove that in order to pull the pulley off. So to do that, we got the proper size socket with a ratchet here, and then just kind of like a steel tube for some extra leverage. That thing was pretty well cranked down, and thankfully with the car in 6th gear, the compression from the engine was enough resistance to keep the pulley from rotating, so we could just break it loose and then remove it. because that was definitely not the case when we went to go crank the new bolt on. So once we were able to remove the OEM crank bolt and take that out, the next step was to actually pull the OEM pulley off of the crankshaft. So in order to do that, you need the proper tool for this. There's no, you can try and do it with one of those kind of common 3-jaw pullers, but basically the best way to do it, go on Amazon. This thing was like 35 bucks. This tool has these 3 arms with these special kind of teeth on them that grip onto the back side of the GM harmonic balancer, and then you use that with a combination of these kind of push rods here to push into the crankshaft, and then you use this guy threads into the back, and then it slowly pulls the OEM harmonic balancer off of the crank. So with several rotations of that puller tool, this thing finally came off, and I'll show you. So the teeth on that puller tool grip onto the back side of this face here. There's like a little lip, so that's why it's really important to get that the GM balancer specific puller tool, and not just like a standard 3-jaw puller tool. You can actually see some green there, right there, where the paint from the puller tool grabbed on to the balancer here, because that puller tool just makes your life so much easier. But man, when we pulled this thing off, I was just thankful that I was going through the trouble to replace this, because this is just a nasty part. I mean, this thing is rusty. It's just caked in oil, dirt, grease, grime, also because the front main seal was leaking. But just after looking at this part, I mean, this car only has 56,000 miles on it, and this thing looks like it came off a car that has 156,000 miles on it. So this is just a bad part, and it just goes to show you, if you're going to go through the trouble to either replace this yourself, because it's a lot of work, or if you're going to shell out a decent amount of money for a shop to do this, just do yourself a favor in the future and buy a better aftermarket harmonic balancer. I've been told by so many people, and as I mentioned in my previous videos, that the OEM balancers that you buy, the OEM replacement balancers that you buy, I think made by AC Delco, I don't know who makes the OEM replacement balancers, but they're just as likely to fail even today because the design was never really changed. So do yourself a favor, either get the Summit Racing one, or if you've got the cash, shell out for the ATI balancer like I did, and you won't have to worry about this ever again. So once we got the balancer off, chuck this thing to the side. Now I'm honestly going to probably keep this as a memento, because this is one of the most involved jobs I've ever done in my garage here. So now with the balancer finally off, it's in your best interest while you're already down this far deep into the car to do some preventative maintenance, even if your front main seal isn't leaking. For me, like I said, mine was, hence why everything was so coated in dirt, grime, and grease. So I had a OEM replacement front main seal. So we removed the original seal, which I can't find. It's somewhere in the mess of a garage right now. You gotta get one of these seal puller tools. You cannot remove that front main seal with like needle nose pliers. You do not want to mar up the front side of the crankshaft. So using that puller tool, we pulled the old seal out, and then the new seal, you just basically use a socket. I'd say about, you know, about this size. This is a 15 millimeter, and we just slowly went in and tapped the new front main seal with even pressure from basically 12 o'clock to 12 o'clock. Tap that in slowly with a rubber mallet. So once that new front main seal was in, I spent a decent amount of time cleaning the front part of the engine, basically the timing cover, and the front part of the oil pan. Everything was pretty well caked in grease, so I just basically all down here, and I thoroughly inspected to make sure the upper oil pan gasket was not leaking. All of the oil was coming basically from the front main seal and then being slung around by the harmonic balancer. So from there, we got everything pretty well cleaned up and prepped to install the new ATI super damper, which you can see down there. So for me, my engine's bone stock, so this damper is probably overkill, but it was the only damper that was in stock at the time when I ordered this. The Summit Racing, I think it's the C2501, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, or I'll put a link for it in the description. That is also another good balancer to replace over the absolute junk OEM one. So next thing you want to do before you start putting on your new balancer is just look in with a flashlight, inspect the internal threads of your crankshaft, and just see if you need to clean those up at all, and chase them, not tap them, just chase them, clean up the threads. For me, the threads looked really clean, so I didn't need to do that. And from that point, it's helpful to have an extra set of hands so someone can kind of brace the balancer as you start to get your installer tool threaded on there to get the new pulley on. So this is a Summit Racing GM Harmonic Balancer install tool. It's basically just a threaded rod with a hex end on this side and then this special installer kind of pusher piece here in the middle. It's got like a floating kind of washer here, and then this is the piece that you actually crank on to press the new balancer onto the pulley or onto the shaft, and then it has a 22mm hex right here as well. Some people say you can just go buy a threaded rod from the store and then get the proper washer stack up and everything. Just if you're going to do that, make sure you get the proper tensile strength threaded rod. You're really going to be cranking down on this, so the last thing you want to happen is the threads to give out on this installer tool. So if you're going to buy just a threaded rod from the store, I highly recommend getting the highest grade possible, grade 8 or higher, or metric, I believe it's 10.9 or higher. But this was just like 22 bucks on Summit Racing, so you can also just get this. And I actually forgot one thing. So before you actually prep your new replacement harmonic balancer, if it has a keyway, for me, I'm not pinning my crank since I'm not running boost, but the stock balancer doesn't have a keyway. So what they recommend, if you're not pinning the crank, get a little bit of RTV and fill that keyway with RTV so it prevents any chance for an oil leak from that part. And then do the best you can. I use like an old credit card or gift card to kind of smooth the RTV into the keyway so that it's a nice smooth transition, and then wipe away any extra RTV on the inner diameter of the harmonic balancer bore. So at that point, then I had my buddy Zach, he held the balancer up. I got the installer tool threaded. Make sure you always use thread lubricant when you're doing this. Just helps keep things from binding. Put thread lubricant on the threads itself and also on this face of the installer tool. So from there you're going to start slowly pressing on the harmonic balancer onto the crank. So as you start using that installer tool to press the harmonic balancer onto the crank, you're going to notice that the engine is most likely going to start rotating, and that's simply because the force needed to press the pulley on to the crankshaft is pretty high. A lot of people say you can heat up the new harmonic balancer, put it in the oven, and you slide it on the crank. You could do that, but at the same time, I've also heard people say don't do that because you risk damaging the new front main seal you just put on. So I just ended up doing the traditional method in order to get this harmonic balancer on. Aside from using heat to get the new balancer onto the crank, the traditional method relies on some type of mechanical stop to keep the engine from turning over as you turn the bolt or installer tool to press on the new harmonic balancer onto the crank. So for some people, if you're doing this on jack stands with only the front two wheels jacked up and the rear tires still on the ground, some people say with the car in gear, that's enough force or resistance to keep the engine from rotating over with the back tires still on the ground. I would highly suggest be very careful if you're going to do that method, because I have no idea how much force it would take to actually rotate the tires enough to push the car forward, lean off the jack stand. So if you're doing it that way, just be very, very careful. For me, that wasn't even an option because I'm on the quick jack, so all four tires were off the ground. So the first thing that we tried to do was to actually chock the back wheels with the cinder blocks and those rubber chocks. That still wasn't enough force to keep the engine from turning over, or there was just enough play in the crank that we weren't actually tightening anything. And if you look up here, we had our breaker bar coming up through here. You don't have a lot of room for actuating the ratchet to do that. So we were maybe getting 2 clicks at best out of the ratchet every time. And then with the rear tires just being able to rotate just slightly, it wasn't even pressing the crank on hardly at all. So that unfortunately meant that we have to go through the very traditional process that so far everyone that I've seen having to do this job has had to do. And that means that you have to get what's basically called a flywheel lockout tool. A flywheel lockout tool, as the name suggests, is a little tool that goes where the starter normally goes. So let's see, you can kind of see it up in there. So right there, that little black piece right here, So that's the hole, right here's the hole where the starter normally goes in. The flywheel lockout tool mounts into the same 2 bolt holes where the starter mounts to, and it has this little arm with teeth on it that mesh with the flywheel to basically lock it in place, as the name suggests. So using that tool and that method, the engine is not going to rotate over at all. You're going to get all of the resistance you need to crank your harmonic balancer onto the crankshaft, because if that starts to move, you've got problems. That means your tool isn't meshed correctly with the flywheel. The only problem is in order to get to that point, which means removing the starter, that means you have to drop the exhaust system, which means undoing the 6 manifold stud bolts here, so 2 mounting bolts in the front, 2 mounting bolts in the back, and then the 4 flange bolts all the way back there. We're dealing with some rusty old hardware here, so that's another issue I'm going to have to chase here, is kind of replacing some of these exhaust studs. And when you do that also, so you can see a wire right there, your O2 sensors are back there behind your cats, so there's these little clips that hold the wire up to the frame of the car. You have to undo those clips so you get the slack you need in those wires to drop this down. This is definitely a 2-person job in order to do this, and you're going to need a whole extra set of jack stands or wood or something to hold this up, because even with the extra slack, that's not enough to fully let this thing rest on the ground, depending on how high your car is up off the ground. So from that point, you can actually take the starter out. So first you start with undoing the 2 electrical connection points. So there's a bunch of wires that connect to the starter, obviously to engage the starter, so you got to undo those. It's just a little stud with a nut, so you basically undo the nut, remove the wires, and then replace the nut back on the stud on the starter. And from there you undo the 2 bolts that mount the starter to the block, and that's where the flywheel lockout tool mounts to, and then you pull your starter out. So with all that being said, now you're at the point where you can actually fully crank your harmonic balancer onto the crankshaft of the car. So at that point we used the breaker bar on top of the ratchet there and started slowly pressing the new balancer on. We were only getting about 2 clicks from the ratchet every throw, so it was slowly but surely, but throughout that process we were keeping a careful eye of like reference points of where we were starting versus where the balancer is now, and we were using the front face and kind of edge of the balancer to see how far we've pressed it on. So in addition, we were using other pulleys on the auxiliary drive to just eyeball the alignment of the new balancer with other pulleys. So we got this tensioner pulley, and then we have the power steering pump pulley on the other side to just eyeball it, but ultimately you want to be a little bit more precise with that. Some people say that you can actually measure from the edge of the front of the crankshaft to the edge of the front face of your balancer. I didn't really want to rely on that because I wasn't sure what balancer they were installing, so if you're using a different balancer, depending on the design, that length might vary, and I couldn't find anything definite for the ATI balancer. So what we ultimately did was to ensure that the balancer was pressed on all the way, I used the original crank bolt in conjunction with the installer tool. So the crank bolt is obviously only a certain length, so when this is threaded completely in, that means that the balancer is pushed on that far and it can't go any farther, because at that point the bolt bottoms out on the crankshaft and it can't be threaded in anymore. So I basically set the installer tool to have the length of the crank bolt at the same length on this side, and when those two are equal, I knew that there is 2.75 inches from the back of the kind of pressing piece of the installer tool to the end here where this hex piece is. So once this length got to 2.75 inches, I knew we were good to go, because the length at the front here matched the OEM crank bolt. So at that point, when we got to the proper length on the installer tool, I just wanted to double check it once more with my eyes, comparing the new balancer with all the other pulleys on the front of the engine, and it looked pretty good to go. So that was when I whipped out my ARP crank bolt. So if you're going to be replacing the harmonic balancer, I highly recommend getting the ARP bolt, because the OEM bolt is not the greatest quality, and it's also a torque to yield bolt, so that you cannot reuse this, and torque to yield also means that you have to torque it in increments, so it just adds a few more steps. The ARP bolt is just definitely a lot better quality. So what you're going to want to do, the ARP bolt comes with the thread lubricant, so you're going to want to put thread lubricant on the bolt threads themselves and also the faces of the bolt flange and the washer that comes with it, so nothing starts to seize and bind on you. From there, start slowly threading it into the crank. Make sure you have proper thread engagement, and you will need a special, or it's not really special, but you'll need a pretty large socket because it's a kind of a 12 points head here for this crank bolt. It's a 27mm socket, so that's what you're going to use to crank that baby on. From there, the bolt should go in pretty easily until you hit the balancer, and at that point, that's when you're going to need a very large torque wrench to get to the required 235 foot-pounds of torque for that crank bolt. So I didn't have a torque wrench that went up that high, so I went to my local O'Reilly's, and they actually rent out torque wrenches that go up to 250 foot-pounds. So I'm going to splice in a few clips of us trying to torque the crank bolt down without a breaker tube, because we needed a breaker tube. And I say tube because this is not a pipe. This is a piece of ABS. That's so how happened to work, because it was 8:30 at night. Home Depot was closed, and this is all I had to work with, and I wanted to get this done. Okay, so we finally achieved the 235 foot-pounds. My friend Zach and I, we were able, without the breaker tube / breaker bar, to achieve 190 foot-pounds, just the two of us pushing on the wrench, but we needed that little bit of extra leverage to get to the 235. So just keep that in mind. Have a really strong friend with you if you're going to be doing that. And we went from the top here. It would be next to impossible to try and do it from the bottom, because I'd say also most of the time people are going to still have the subframe installed. So that, ladies and gentlemen, wraps up installing the new harmonic balancer onto the engine of my C5 Corvette. So this video is already probably way too long, but I just wanted to be super thorough in explaining all of the steps that I did to get to this point. I apologize for not filming more of actually in-process wrenching to do all this stuff, but a lot of this required a lot of focus and just attention, especially when I'm dropping the subframe out of the car, doing the motor mounts, the exhaust system. So I really wanted to focus to make sure I'm doing everything correctly, being safe, etc., etc. So that's why I wanted to go back and explain and walk through everything, because there's not a ton of people on YouTube that are dropping the whole subframe of their Corvette in their garage here, minus a few people that do it for their day jobs for racing and whatnot. So I just wanted to be as helpful as I can to anybody else that's looking at doing this job themselves. Replacing the harmonic balancer is a lot of work, but you save yourself a lot of money, and it's kind of rewarding because you get to learn a little bit more about your car. So like I said, this video is already too long. In the next video, we'll be basically doing everything else, replacing the motor mounts, getting the subframe back all situated, getting the exhaust back all situated, etc., etc. So thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you stuck to this point in the video. If you guys have any comments or questions, as always, feel free to leave them below, and I'll be happy to answer them or converse with you guys. Thank you all so much for subscribing. If you haven't already, definitely hit that subscribe button for a lot more awesome Corvette content to come. So thank you guys, and we will see you in the next one.